who is Professor Emerita of Modern Jewish History at Cornell University, where she held the Thomas and Diane Mann Professorship of Modern Jewish Studies from 1997 until 2014. Her major publications, which many of you know, I'm sure, include Between France and Germany, The Jews of Alsace-Lorraine, 1871 to 1918, published in 1988, and Uneasy Asylum, France and the Jewish Refugee Crisis, 1933 to 1942, both published by Stanford University Press, and both classics. She is currently working, she hasn't really retired apparently, she is currently working on the first volume of a projected 2-volume study of the relations between Jews and Catholics in fin de siècle France, entitled The Battle for the Republic. Thank you, Vicki. Oops.
Thank you very much, Josh. All 3 of these excellent papers deal with varieties of violence in the late Third Republic, and especially in the 1930s. Usually when we think of violence in this period, we think above all of political violence, especially clashes between right and left. Here we can have, as Chris Millington shows, violence that erupts when left and right-wing groups encounter each other in street protests, as well as violence perpetrated by the police against members of either of these groups. On the other hand, we also see violence perpetrated by members of these groups against the police. During the 1930s, we even have violence perpetrated by citizens seeking to launch a coup against the state, the colonial veterans that Carolyn Campbell talks about, or the Kabul, another far right-wing group that emerged in the late 30s that also sought a violent overthrow of the government. One of the central themes of all of these papers is that there was a high level of violence in France during the 30s, and that the Republic was, in fact, in danger, contrary to the assertions of Serge Bernstein and some other historians who described this last decade of the Third Republic as relatively calm, especially in comparison to Germany at the time of Hitler's seizure of power, or Italy at the time of the fascist seizure of power in the 20s. Probably the most poignant symbol, at least to me, of the high level of violence in interwar France is that photograph of Lamblum bruised and battered after he was pulled out of a car in February of 1936 by members of the Camarades Droit, the youth group of the Action Française, while crowds lined the streets shouting, "Kill him, kill him." But aside from this sort of political violence, there was also the violence of everyday life, as Miranda Sachs reminds us. This sort of violence took place in prisons, in reformatories for juvenile delinquents, the focus of Sachs' paper, and in internment camps set up for foreigners in the late 1930s. Moreover, as Sachs shows, this sort of everyday violence was influenced by the broader political situation. Protests demanding greater social justice and equality, such as those that erupted at the time of the Popular Front, had an impact on what was transpiring in these settings as well. One final thought before I zero in on the individual papers is the striking degree to which all of these papers resonate with contemporary events, at least in the US and even in France. I never used to do this, but now one can't help it. We've seen in this country over the past 2 years a number of incidents linked to police violence and many questions being raised about how much force is appropriate for police to use in specific contexts, as well as questions about the extent to which police forces ought to be militarized, the subject of Chris Millington's paper. We've also had many stories in recent years about the treatment of juveniles in prisons and reformatories. We've seen, I think in the last 2 years, some stories about the especially brutal treatment of juveniles at Rikers Island and questions about whether juvenile delinquents ought to be kept in solitary confinement. And finally, and quite amazingly, we've even heard discussions about the legitimacy of using armed force to overthrow the government, the subject of Carolyn Campbell's paper. In his speech to CPAC, not the one that just occurred like a week and a half ago, but the one he gave the previous year, Wayne LaPierre, the head of the National Rifle Association, declared, quote, "Make no mistake, if the violent left brings their terror to our communities, our neighborhoods, or into our homes, they will be met with the resolve and the strength and the full force of American freedom in the hands of American people." Let me turn to the individual papers. Actually, for some reason, I'm not dealing with them in the order they were presented here. But first, on Chris Millington's paper, he asked two questions. First, how did political groups in the 1930s frame violence? How did these political groups use violence, especially encounters, in encounters with the police, as a propaganda tool to advance their political agendas? And then second, how did the police use violence to control crowds engaged in street protests? How much force was acceptable? What sort of force was acceptable? And did the restraints on police violence change over time? Although Millington stresses the continuity of police practices and personnel irrespective of what administration was in power, what we now call the deep state, he does show that police training manuals encouraged considerable restraint, and that the Third Republic seemed extremely concerned that the police not appear to be using excessive force or to be highly militarized. Millington calls this policy of restraint on the part of the police masculine. We may have skipped over that, but I wonder whether this notion of masculinity might be at odds with other notions of masculinity prevalent at this time. For example, the notion of hypermasculinity that Carolyn Campbell talks about in her paper on the Colonial Veterans Association shunned restraint in favor of swift, decisive, and aggressive action. Millington also shows that the police were prepared to turn a blind eye to a certain level of violence among rival factions of the citizenry. For example, throwing some punches at a political meeting did not generally result in arrests. Actually, he said maybe that toleration of that low-level violence encouraged a higher level of violence, but it could actually be the reverse. It's a way of sort of allowing a certain amount of violence, letting off steam, just to control crowds. And those of us who worked on the late 19th century know the police generally tolerated that level of violence as well. They usually shut it down by shutting off the gas lights, and then everybody would disperse and go home, and that would be the end of it. At the same time, Millington shows that a certain level of violence used by the police was tolerated by the citizens, especially if such violence was deemed necessary for self-defense. And here Millington does point out that the incidence of violent confrontations between the police and the citizenry was 4 to 5 times higher in the late 30s than it had been in the 20s or even in the early 1930s. Although here too, unfortunately, he's not here to answer this, but it would be useful to know whether most of these violent confrontations involved groups on the right or the left. One also wonders how this state of constant confrontation in the late 30s prepared the police for the more difficult tasks ahead, such as rounding up Jews under Vichy or even rounding up foreigners in the late 30s. In addition, I can't help but ask the perennial question, again, some of you may know, of whether there was any perceptible political bias on the part of the police. Did they harbor secret sympathies for the right or for the left? Actually, I think you mentioned that, Chris mentioned that some of these right-wing groups suspected the police of having communist sympathies. And perhaps some of them did. I also wonder how they reacted to changes in regime, not just the transition from the Third Republic to Vichy, but also the constant shifts in administration in the 1930s. And finally, do we know what type of men went into the police force? What were their social backgrounds, their educational levels, etc.? Some of these questions may have been addressed in some recent historical literature. The fuller fleshing out of these issues would be highly welcome. Carolyn Campbell's paper examines the leadership of the Anak and the National Union of Colonial Veterans, or the Colonial Veterans, and especially the head of those associations in the early 30s, Jean Ferrandi. Here she seeks to understand whether the veterans involved in colonial wars brought a particular sort of violent behavior back to the metropole and then apply that violence to contemporary politics. Campbell claims that the lesson learned by Ferrandi, who spent 8 years engaged in colonial warfare in Chad, was that rapid, quote, aggressive and violent action, unquote, yielded the best political results. Hence, Campbell sees Ferrandi as a bridge between colonial warfare and metropolitan politics. She also introduces a gender and racial analysis. She speaks of him as representing hypermasculinity. In addition to his belief in the efficacy of swift and decisive action, he also adhered to rigid notions of gender hierarchy. Women's place was definitely in the home, as well as rigid racial hierarchy. Here, blacks from the colonies, as well as Jews at home, were deemed to be inferior, and Jews in particular were linked to the dangerous Asiatic force of communism. Above all, Campbell argues Ferrandi believed in the right to launch an insurrection against the state whenever the state was exercising illegitimate power. Exactly when that was isn't always so clear. Here she shows that Ferrandi rejected the idea of achieving change through electoral activity or even through mass politics, as exemplified by the politics of Colonel de la Roque and the Croix de Feu. By contrast, Ferrandi believed that an elite group of army officers should seize control of the state apparatus. Finally, Campbell also sees the participation of Ferrandi and other colonial veterans in the mass demonstration of February 1934 as posing a significant threat to the state. And she points out that this demonstration, which brought thousands out into the streets and resulted in 15 deaths and 200 people being seriously wounded, constituted the first occasion in the history of the Third Republic when a street demonstration forced an administration to step down. So here I just have a few questions. First, among colonial troops, how was the conflict between the French policy of assimilation and the extreme xenophobia and anti-Semitism of the troops resolved? How were these attitudes expressed? Did they appear in the publications of these organizations? And were there conflicts between the officers and the troops, or between the officers and the colonial administration over these issues? Campbell also suggests that individuals like Ferrandi were sui generis in advocating insurrection against the Republic, and she suggests that his death in the mid-30s severely diminished the possibility of or the likelihood of such an insurrection. But were representatives of these veterans organizations alone in advocating armed insurrection? By the late 30s, there were other groups, the Cagoule, which I mentioned before, also led by a veteran, George Justinau Lapau, which also advocated armed insurrection against the state. And many members of that group went on to join the milice under Vichy. Moreover, other groups on the far right in the 30s, such as the Ligue Franc-Catholique, which included Xavier Vallat and Philippe Henriot, also called for the coming of the Fourth Republic. It's true that that could come about through electoral means, but I don't think that's really what they were talking about. So I wonder here how unique Ferrandi really is, or whether his views were held by other veterans groups or even other groups on the far right. A second, I'm trying to sum this up, I think. One other question I have here is about the role of the Paris Municipal Council, where Ferrandi served as a representative. During the 1930s, the Paris Municipal Council became a hotbed of extreme right-wing activity. One other member of the Paris Municipal Council who later became notorious was Darquier de Pellepoix, who later became the Commissioner General for Jewish Affairs. These extreme right-wing activities in the council not only pitted right against left, but they also pitted the extreme right against the moderate right. I'll just say one example here. In 1938, a row broke out in the Paris Municipal Council after Darquier de Pellepoix protested the action by the president of the council, Le Provost de Louanay, who had sent a letter of congratulations to the newly appointed chief rabbi of France on behalf of the entire council. In response to Darquier de Pellepoix's complaint, the president of the council, who was a conservative and not particularly friendly to Jews, publicly rebuked Darquier de Pellepoix for his outrageous anti-Semitic behavior, which he claimed was promoting a spirit of national divisiveness. So here I'm just wondering, how did the Paris, is this something, I know actually in the early 20th century, the Paris Municipal Council was also a hotbed of extreme right-wing activity, but I'm just wondering if you might speak a little bit more about that. And also, were the ideas about the right to insurrection articulated openly there? And again, well, the third point just has to do with the comparison to Leroux. How do we explain the difference between Ferrandi and Leroux on these? Leroux seemed to still adhere to some notion of mass, that at least a mass movement was legitimate, and some idea that you could achieve change through electoral politics. The final paper is Miranda Sachs's paper on juvenile delinquency in interwar France. Here she looks at low-level violence in juvenile detention facilities, specifically for girls, and she focuses on these sensational escape episodes in the 30s. Here she shows that these girls were not well treated. There were complaints about bad medical care, bad hygiene, poor work conditions, and brutal treatment at the hands of the monitors. In terms of understanding why these girls revolted at this particular moment in 1936, a year of extraordinary political effervescence, we need to understand how much news from the outside world these girls received. Did they read newspapers while they were in the homes? You mentioned that they did generally have access to radios, and also how much interaction with other workers did they have. Most significantly, Sachs asked whether popular attitudes toward juvenile delinquents changed over time. Obviously, in some quarters, public opinion was becoming more sympathetic. She talks about L'Humanité taking up their cause, and the journalist Alexis Danan, who wrote a series of articles on their plight. And he's an interesting character because he also dealt with Jewish youth after World War II. In one of the recent books that has just come out, she talks about him. So the role of these journalists is interesting, but it's not so clear to me whether there was broader change. Did the Popular Front specifically take up this issue, and were there any institutional changes enacted in the aftermath of their escape? Well, other questions concern the role of social work and how it's changing also at this time. Finally, what does this episode tell us about one of the major topics of discussion in the 1930s, youth and their future? Sachs's paper, on the one hand, reminds us that violence was not only linked to political debates between left and right, rather, as is true today, the level of violence tolerated in everyday life, in schools, prisons, reformatories, internment camps for refugees, tells us a great deal about the nature of those societies in which that violence occurs. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, there is a film, so people should understand that it is being recorded.
Oh, okay.
But I guess, are you going to move the camera around?
No, camera's not going to move around. It'll just be
Okay.
on you guys. It's just that the question will be heard.
Disembodied voice.
Yeah.
And do you want me to say Sarah Fishman? Okay. For Miranda. So I'm going to put these two things together. These are girls. When you're talking about fear of delinquents and violence, you're usually talking about the boys and the Apaches or whatever, marauding around the city. So the fact that it's the girls that are perpetrating this violence, I wonder to what extent that is even more of a shock, or how that's incorporated into, the fear of the delinquent versus the delinquent as a victim. So.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things I've noted in the documents from this period is that, as you very well know, the majority of young people brought to trial are male, but the proportion of males who are let out is much higher than girls. So if a girl is charged, she's more likely to be put in an institution, and I found a quote where they say, in fact, that these girls are very delinquent, that if a girl is committing a crime, that there's something about her character that's corrupted. And so I think that does relate to these girls. On the one hand, some of them are a little bit misled and faible, weak, but on the other hand, there is the sense that they are this embodiment of this something that's going wrong with the morality, that these girls already are sexually deviant, and then they can't even behave in these reformatories that they'll charge their monitors. And in fact, the ones that break out, and I can't corroborate this, but the way that they're cast is that they have pimps on the outside. So that this sort of, to refer back to Vicki's question about, what is their contact with the outside world? These ones that are particularly seemingly deranged in these people's eyes are ones that have pimps. Do they ever get caught? That's something I don't, some of them initially do, and a couple of them are found. So my other sort of hat as an urban historian, just thinking about space, they make it from Boulogne to Rochechouart. So they make it all the way to the north of Paris, like practically to the Goutte d'Or, right? So the other sort of image, and they're just sort of wandering around helplessly. They haven't eaten, because the other piece about these girls is they're not Parisian for the most part. A lot of them are from the countryside, so that they're in fact almost being more corrupted by being in these homes, because then they're exposed to this urban world. And then to relate back to Vicki's question again about how much do they know about the outside world, they aren't allowed visitors very often. It's fairly limited. But there's these windows that they're in these neighborhoods and people are walking by, and that's one of their things, is that they're upset that the windows are closed. They're in these workspaces that aren't aerated because the monitors are closing the windows so that they can't talk to people on the street. And I think in some cases they're probably just like flirting with the people on the street. That would be my guess. But there is this fear of this interaction that's happening.
Yes, there in the back.
Thanks. I have a general question about violence. Violence is when a fist hits a body, or someone is shot or gagged or whatever. So there is kind of violence as a thing in itself in these papers, but there seem to be different reasons for the moment of violence, and one in 1934 seems to be rhetoric by other means, right? And for the young girls who are in being kept, it seems to be a response to conditions. So if they had been properly fed and given proper clothing and all that, would there have been violence? And then we have the police in between, basically trying to monitor violence. They are called out because there is a situation, and they're essentially then in between. So what is then violence? Is it something that is the physical manifestation of something else, or why are we focusing on violence itself as a phenomenon? And I know that there are other people in the room who work on violence, so it might be a broader question than just for the panel. Thanks.
I guess I think that there could be as many different definitions of violence as there are fascism, and so it depends on kind of what you're looking at, and one of the types of violence I think is really interesting are ideas about symbolic violence that somebody like Bourdieu was talking about. So I don't think think violence always has to be physical. It can take many forms. It can be psychological, and then it can be long-term structural. That can lead to things like poverty and famine. So I guess if we think about who is defining violence, if we look at how the historical actors who are involved in different episodes actually define the violence. So if we look at the insurrection or riots or demonstration of February 6, 1934, whatever you want to call it, the people who are involved in that, they see violence as a means to an end, and they see it as being something that is physical. So for them, violence is something that is dramatic and spectacular, not something that's more structural and psychological.
I mean, to add to that, the way that I thought about it going into this paper was both in terms of the representation of it, but also the way that it's imagined. So that, in a sense, danger and the way that danger acts. I did have something, to answer one of your questions about Chris, that you asked Chris. I happen to know that policemen often were veterans. So it actually ties to work, particularly at the early Third Republic, at least. But the policemen in the city of often have that sort of
How?
Thank you. Maybe, Leanna, you were referring to other people who work on violence. Very briefly, I think we should start with the notion that violence has a moral connotation as a term that's negative. Okay? We could call it a use of force and try to be neutral in our terminology, but when we use the word violence, we tend to be judging that use of force in some negative way. It has a moral connotation to it. Second, it tends to be disruptive. It violates, it erupts, it breaks into, in some sense, the normalcy of the moment. And I think that's important. We don't call a drought a violent drought, but it may do plenty of damage. We call a storm a violent storm and may do a lot less damage. But it's disruptive. It sort of breaks into the normal weather pattern, that sort of thing. So I think we need to keep both of those as limiting factors in how we deploy the term violence. That we should think of it as morally connotated and in some ways physically disruptive. And it isn't just an institutional pattern of discrimination. Then we're beginning to erode any meaning in the word violence. Not that we approve of the discrimination, but we don't need to characterize it with terminology that then becomes, yes, pejorative for the discrimination, but not helpful in the analysis.
Can I use my ability as chair to comment a little bit? And then we'll go on. I'm really glad that Howard made that point, but I do want to, because I agree that with everything that you say, but I wonder if in the kinds of historical work that we do, contextualized in different places, it often becomes very hard to decide when is something really disruptive, right? What's the difference? Miranda actually used the term ordinary violence of daily life, which implies that there are moments in which disruptions become part of what's normal, part of what's routine, part of what is actually maintaining an existing social or political structure. And so, although I agree that it is really important to delimit what we mean by violence, I also think that when it comes to policing, concern with public order, maintaining, free movement through cities, all the kinds of things that are part of what institutions like the police do on a routine and daily basis. Not all of it is meant to be disruptive. Some of it is meant to be permanent and clockwork, and yet it produces sharp ruptures in the distribution of power, the kinds of vulnerability that different populations are forced to live within, and sometimes violence is the word you want to use to describe the maintenance of those kinds of inequalities.
Also, this idea that violence has a moral connotation that's always negative. One of the things that I find most disturbing about fascist or far-right activists is that they often saw violence in a positive way as something that was morally good, as a way, almost like an act of purification, like it's a way that you can purify. And so that has a positive connotation for some people. So, I mean, today we can sit and say violence has a negative connotation, but I think that it hasn't always been like that, and that is one of the characteristics of some of these groups that some people would call fascist and other people might call far right.
But that's true of that as well. You know, one was a revolutionary for many people, obviously, so in a positive way.
All right, I appreciate both perspectives, but what I'm saying is how we use the term as historians.
Right.
Okay, I think it's very important that we understand that when we're inserting the word violence, we are actually taking a moral judgment into our analysis. And sometimes that's appropriate and sometimes it isn't. And I'm not saying that violence hasn't been approved of by some people like revolutionaries or, you know, right-wing thugs or whatever, right? True enough. The point is, as we historians try to analyze what's going on, in response to Josh a little bit, it might be daily physical abuse that sustains a system, but in some ways that's still disruptive of normal human relations. That's not normal human relations for the most part. So I think as we analyze things, we want to...
just a morally freighted word is violence, I would say.
What is? Normal, sure. Normalcy, yeah, but...
Okay.
I don't think we'll go round and around, but I wanted to make my point clear that I'm talking about how historians use the term.
Right. Point taken.
And that might be worth thinking about why the 30s and 40s in France are so exceptional, right? Because this regime that we know in the 40s, in World War II, you have everyday life. And, you know, you have the resistance on one hand, and then you have Vichy and the Nazis on the other, where violence becomes part of daily life. And so to look in the 30s and see how this becomes instrumental. How does this become built into something? It is disruptive, but it is normalized. And that's maybe why it's so jarring in this group.
Well, I think the decision of a historian to use certain terms at one time or another is a really interesting and important question. When do you use the word violence? When do you not? And I say that because there's a similar debate among historians of fascism. And some historians of fascism are just fine using the fascist label today to describe groups in the past when they're as fascist, even though those groups at the time might say we're not fascist. Whereas another, in this debate, a group would be one of them. They'd say, well, you can never call it fascist. You need to use the terms that people used at the time, because that helps us to understand what people actually believed at the time. So I see what you're saying. When historians use violence or as much as there's a debate like that, just as much as there's a debate when do we use the word fascism and what's its speak when the term is used.
Rebecca McCoy. I was trying to think what linked these together, and Liana's point also made me think very hard, because I also work on violence, but I work on religious violence in an earlier period. And I was trying to think very hard how the ways you described violence fit in with what I do. And it seems to me that maybe one of the themes is violence is a way of exerting control. And that accounts, I mean, that's not the only way to explain it, but that would account certainly for the way you're controlling young girls in a reform institution, how you're trying to exert political control, how you would be dealing with other kinds of violence, like the religious violence that I look at, because you're trying to control the conversation about religion in France and France's identity over religion. But it also accounts for things like what we sometimes call verbal violence. To me, violence is about trying to control people.
Anybody want to respond to that?
It's one kind of violence, but also there's the violence coming from right. So, so I would say, I mean, we have to say, because by the degree of threat that the police are supposed to be exercising, police officials indicate that telephone use so I found that interesting. I wish I could get
Maybe pick this. Oh, you go ahead. Want to question?
Christine Grant from Carnegie Mellon. Just kind of following on that idea of control and the idea of restraint, I know that in these juvenile reformatories from the 1840s, they were set up as being places where you didn't get any corporal punishment, any kind of physical violence from the monitors, etc. So I guess for Miranda, do you see this idea of these women monitors being kind of brutal in some ways? Does that delegitimate their control over the girls? And I guess linking that to that idea of do the police have to show restraint, because if not, it delegitimizes their control. Is a lack of violence, is a constraint on their own violence actually a way to show authority and control?
That's an interesting way of thinking. I think the use of excess force is what finally ends up turning the tide, and that's what these inspectors who come in, they're willing to empathize with the girls to a certain extent when that happens. The other thing, the sort of theme of, like, another bomb in the middle of this sexual violence, right? These girls, sometimes their careers start out because they are sexual violence. They wouldn't care for themselves. This is part, like, again, how we're using languages. We would use that term. They would not use that term. They then, when I'm alluding to my paper, they accuse the monitor of being overly familiar with the woman when she's younger too, and it's this kind of affection. And they turn, and the inspectors say, actually, they basically decide not to make an assessment, but they say, armor, that's another form of violence. That's a kind of to them, it's a tool. They're using the particular physical against this older woman.
Hi, thank you. I have a question. Miranda, you just said something in your response, I think, to somebody. You talked about I forget the wording, but something like the extraordinary times of the interwar period, the extraordinary violence or the unique violence. And I'm not a historian of the 20th century, but what's extraordinary about or exceptional about the violence of the interwar period? I ask that because, well, Howard, you'll know, in the few years leading up to the French Revolution, there were dozens of riots across France, bread riots, some of them way more violent than anything you're describing here, with a lot more casualties. I'm just wondering what is actually exceptional in terms of the disruption of every life, except the fact that they're in an interwar period. Of course, they don't know that they're in an interwar period, right? So we can assume that, but do they think it's exceptional? And it's actually related to something else. You also said in your paper, in your presentation, the riots of these girls. I was kind of struggling, and you yourself asked at some point, are these really riots? Is that what we want to call them? What are these disturbances? And you said it's very close to the general strike, all right? Chronologically and geographically, very close to the... And I thought that a strike and a riot are very, very different forms of disruption and disturbance. In fact, I recently read a book called Riot, Strike, Riot, I think by Joshua Glover, where he claimed that the 18th century was a period of riots and the 19th century was a period of strikes. And now, I don't know what he says about the interwar period. It's not about France, the book, but now we're in a period of riots again. And he makes interesting distinctions. He says riots are usually about the price of stuff, and strikes are usually about the price of labor. And all kinds of interesting distinctions along these ways. So I wonder what connection there is there between the strike and the riot, or is this more like a prison riot, a little bit, what you're describing? Those are my questions.
30s are a time of strikes, too.
It's just general disorder. I might leave that one to you. But to take the first one, though, I think they're trying to strike. They try to present their demands. In the second one, they refuse to work. And the difference between them and the strikers is that they are the powerless. the strikers are able to come together and that they're able to negotiate. But these are women, so they're women, they're females, they're minors, and they're delinquents. So in all three ways, they have lost all rights to negotiate. And they're told they can't, and so this question about control, right, they turn to violence because that's the one way that they can have control. But again, I have no idea if they are in touch with the general strikes. I would surmise, given that they're going to their directors and actually asking. So that's my theory about that.
Well, I mean, in terms of, again, using terms, with the events of February 6th, I had often learned it and seen it referred to in the historiography often as riots or demonstrations. And it was when I did really close reading of the Commission of Inquiry, which I talked about in my paper, the Commission of Inquiry that was created after the riots to investigate them. It was in reading through the 3,000 pages of reporting on it that they're the ones who called. They did not want the word riot. They did not want the word demonstration. They wanted the word insurrection because, again, that was the word that the participants themselves were using, and so it helped the commission to understand what it was that they kind of thought that they were doing. So I don't know if people that you're studying ever called their actions like.
It's not a move. It's not.
Yeah.
I think they do use the word insurrection. Okay. Yeah.
Because then it would be interesting, like, why are they choosing that language? And what do they believe it's going to convey? Because I think that's hard. It's a hard question because you have to really get into their heads to try to figure out what's motivating them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of insubordination. Like, these girls are not following the rules of
I could pick up on that. Did anybody see the amazing talk that Camille Robsy gave yesterday about? She talked about Fanon as a practicing psychiatrist. Of course, Fanon is the author of Concerning Violence, right? That first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth. But in his psychiatric practice in the 1950s, he was trying to engage his patients in such a way as to not compound their psychic damage by creating institutions that define them as sick, and rather look for ways to heal the staff of the hospital that he was working in, to create a social environment around them in which there was a cafe, in which there were activities, and it's all sort of thinking about reformatories and institutions under the Third Republic, or in Fanon's case, the Fourth Republic, in ways in which a kind of psychic damage imposed by institutions, penal institutions like this, became part of the way that he himself thought about the relationship of damaged individuals to a violent society. Right? It was a great talk. If I could make just one more connection to, I think one thing that we maybe neglected a little bit, which we should really emphasize about Caron's paper, is that she is making a very important intervention about the importation of a specifically colonial kind of violence, a violence that's conceived of within a colonial realm, to the metropolitan, much earlier in some ways than we're very used to thinking about this as happening in the late 1950s, in the desperate last stages of the Algerian War. And in fact, in the literature on police violence in Paris in 1960-61, or 61-62, between 17th of October 61 and Charonne in 1962, there's a literature on police violence. Same thing comes up. Police unions that are communist, the importation of colonial techniques right there. And in that literature, all the same things are reproduced that we've been talking about here. Alain de Verp has taught, he refuses to say that the violence of the police in Charonne in 1962 is colonial violence. He says, listen, the ability to inflict extreme violence on the population is part of every state. He's a kind of Weberian approach. The monopoly of violence means that any state can do it whether they're colonial or not, whereas Neil McMaster and Jim House have specifically argued that this is a racialized violence brought from North Africa to police in the late 1960s. And so you've actually pushed this much earlier in a way that makes us, think of, I think that's really important to say. Yeah.
Ben Trotter, I think for the Germans, there are those who have traced, found Nazi roots back in for instance, the genocide in Namibia,
Right,
the
of course.
Herero. I think is it
Isabel Hull's work, Absolute Destruction.
Yeah, and also too, I was just thinking of the fact that Hitler was fascinated with the British Empire and really wanted to emulate them as empire builders. And so I think that idea of the violence there from the colonial world coming in there, I think it's very true. It's having an influence long before the 1950s.
Thank you. We've now come a couple minutes beyond our time, so I want to thank you all for coming and thank the panelists for inviting me to participate.